Hello and welcome to lecture number 35. This is topic 2.24, Freedom Days, commemorating the ongoing struggle for freedom. This will be the last lecture of Unit 2. And the first learning objective is to describe the events that officially ended legal enslavement in the United States. We'll start with the Emancipation Proclamation, which we discussed in the previous lecture. This was a wartime order first introduced in 1862 when Lincoln began to realize or was convinced that slavery and the war went inextricably linked. This means that to defeat the Confederacy, he also had to fight against slavery. He was convinced by some in his cabinets to wait to issue the proclamation until the Union Army secured a major victory. So he waited until the bloody Battle of Antietam. Though it was not a victory for either side, it was a stalemate, which was good enough for Lincoln to issue the proclamation. The official version was issued on January 1st, 1863, and it provided freedom only for the enslaved people in the territories in a state of rebellion. This was difficult to enforce because those territories were in rebellion, and federal policies were not enforced there. However, the announcement encouraged at least 50,000 enslaved people to walk off their plantations in just the first few months after its announcement. The Confederacy, for its part, issued a counter-proclamation. In February 1863, Jefferson Davis stated any free black person in the Confederacy was now subject to enslavement. While this counter-proclamation was also not widely enforced, Davis did give the order to capture and enslave any free black person the Confederate forces might encounter while fighting the war. In General Lee's campaign to Gettysburg, he brought back several dozen freed people who were then later sold into slavery. Even after the war ended in April 1865, legal slavery continued in 4 border states: Maryland, Missouri, Delaware, and Kentucky. These states had not been affected by the 1863 proclamation for fear that they would secede and join the Confederacy. Maryland, Missouri, Delaware, and Kentucky continued to have legal slavery until the 13th Amendment was fully ratified in December 1865. The 13th Amendment was introduced and passed by Congress and signed by Abraham Lincoln in January 1865. It took about 11 months to be ratified as the law of the land. This permanently abolished slavery in the United States except as punishment for a duly convicted crime. This is something we will revisit in Unit 3, as it provided southern states a loophole to keep black people in a legal form of servitude. The 13th Amendment effectively freed 4 million African Americans, which were nearly 1/3 of the South's population. This amendment was significant not only for ending slavery, but also for setting the stage for future civil rights advancements. It was the first step towards achieving freedom, justice, and inclusion. While it ended slavery, it did not mention or change anything about the treatment of African Americans in the country. That would wait until the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship rights for everyone born in the country, and the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote to all men who were citizens of the United States. One group of enslaved people not impacted by the Emancipation Proclamation or the 13th Amendment were those in Indian Territory. About 10,000 African Americans were enslaved by indigenous nations. The Indian Territory, located in modern-day Oklahoma, was not subject to federal laws banning slavery due to treaties that granted American Indian nations semi-sovereign status. The Cherokee, Choctaw, and the Chickasaw, as we saw in a previous lecture, were fully committed to the institution of slavery because of the wealth it generated. An elite group of American Indian planters sided with the Confederacy, and the picture on the screen is actually of a Confederate reunion amongst the Cherokee Nation in the 19th century. The other two of the so-called civilized tribes, the Seminole and the Creek, had divided support for the Union and the Confederacy. Because they took up arms against the United States, it invalidated some of the previous treaties that they had entered into. So the Reconstruction Treaties of 1866 mandated that slavery be abolished and that freedmen or former enslaved people in Indian Territory be given tribal citizenship. The Reconstruction Treaties of 1866 were crucial in ensuring the freedom of enslaved people in Indian Territory, though enforcement was challenging and continued into the 21st century. The second learning objective is to explain why Juneteenth is historically and culturally significant. Juneteenth is the holiday that marks the end of slavery in the last state of rebellion, Texas. Texas was isolated from both Union and Confederate forces early in the war due to the Union's Anaconda Plan, which aimed to cut the Confederacy in half and restricted supply lines west of the Mississippi. After Grant's victory at the Siege of Vicksburg, the western Confederate states of Arkansas and Texas were isolated from the fighting. On June 18, 1865, Union forces arrived in the coastal city of Galveston. General Gordon Granger read General Order No. 3 to the enslaved people, telling them that the war was over and that slavery had been abolished. This document is significant because it is also the first official document mentioning racial equality, stating absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. Despite this progressive language, there were problematic instructions. General Order Number 3 advised enslaved people to stay on plantations and work for wages. The Union was ill-prepared to deal with the large number of newly freed people, so they encouraged them to stay on plantations and demand wages from their former enslavers. This was difficult to enforce, as enslavers could cheat them out of the wages, and it forced enslaved people to stay on plantations where they had been previously brutalized. The issuance of General Order Number 3 was a critical moment, symbolizing the end of slavery, but also highlighting the challenges of transitioning to freedom. For example, the order also stated that the federal government would not support any formerly enslaved people in idleness, meaning no aid would be sent to help them move or leave. African Americans have a tradition of celebrating Freedom Days. In addition to Juneteenth, African Americans in New York have celebrated the abolition of slavery since 1827, their holiday being July 5th. In Washington, D.C., they celebrated Emancipation Day on April 16, 1862, as a result of the Compensated Emancipation Act, which paid enslavers a set price for all the enslaved people they held. The enslaved people themselves were not paid any compensation for the wages that were extracted from them or the exploitation that they experienced. Juneteenth is one of the many Freedom Days, and even in Texas, there were several Freedom Days celebrated, as they differed based on when people heard of their freedom after the Union Army began to march from Galveston to the rest of the state. Ultimately, Texas settled on Juneteenth as a formal day. Into the 20th century, Black Texans who moved out of the state, especially during World War II, took the holiday with them to other Black communities. Thus, Juneteenth began to be celebrated in cities like Los Angeles, Oakland, Portland, and many others. Over time, the holiday started to be forgotten, so much so that by the 1970s, many people, even in Texas, were unfamiliar with its origins or motives. It was rediscovered in the 1980s, and there was a drive for national recognition through the 1990s and early 2000s. One of the major pieces of activism was done by Opal Lee, nicknamed the grandmother of Juneteenth. At the age of 89, she marched from her home in Fort Worth, Texas to Washington, D.C. in 2016. Finally, in 2021, it was officially made into a federal holiday after 150 years of its first celebration. Opal Lee's dedication to making Juneteenth a federal holiday underscores the importance of preserving and recognizing African American history and culture. Some of the earliest Juneteenth celebrations were also called Jubilee Days or Emancipation Days. They were initially used as gatherings to locate missing family members separated due to slave sales or auctions, and they became a staging ground for family reunions. The celebrations included singing spirituals, feasting, dancing, and wearing new clothing, which symbolized the newfound freedom. By 1900, the celebrations had expanded to include baseball games, horse races, street fairs, rodeos, railroad excursions, and formal balls. The holiday evolved with the popular culture of the time. Into the 20th century, a mainstay of the celebration was to honor the oldest surviving former slave. The person, whoever it was given a place of honor. And as the years passed, the place of honor grew in proportion to the dwindling number of survivors each year. The evolution of Juneteenth celebration reflects the resilience and adaptability of African American culture, maintaining traditions while incorporating new elements. Honoring these individuals allowed the community to have visible elders who held communal knowledge that could be passed down. They were revered for their survival and resistance to the institution of slavery. Finally, Juneteenth and Freedom Days commemorate three major things: the ancestors' role in the struggle to end slavery, the post-slavery embrace of a fraught freedom, and the commitment to seeking joy and validation in themselves. Celebrating the roles of figures like Frederick Douglass, who heavily lobbied President Lincoln to abolish slavery, and Harriet Tubman, who organized a spy network to help the Union Army win battles, highlights the significant contributions of African Americans to fight for freedom. The post-slavery embrace of a fraught freedom acknowledges that they did not gain complete equal rights immediately after slavery, but remained active and engaged in the fight for full equality. This is seen in the participation of civil rights organizations in Juneteenth parades. The picture on the screen shows members of the NAACP carrying a banner and showing their support for the parade. The ongoing participation of civil rights organizations in Juneteenth celebrations demonstrates the continued relevance of the struggle for equality and justice. Finally, Juneteenth and Freedom Day celebrations commemorate the commitments to seeking joy and validation in themselves, despite the nation's delayed recognition of an important moment in history. This idea of self-validation contains elements of Black nationalist movements. Martin R. Delaney's advocacy for racial pride and Black nationalism in his book Principia of Ethnology reflects the early foundations of this movement. In the 20th century, the movement grew further in the 1920s and 30s with the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, and the Nation of Islam movement by figures like Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X. And finally, to recap, the Emancipation Proclamation was a declaration of freedom, but it did not impact all enslaved people. The 13th Amendment permanently abolished slavery, though it was inapplicable to convicts and enslaved people in Indian Territory. Juneteenth commemorates the day the last enslaved people were informed of their freedom in Texas. Juneteenth became a federal holiday in 2021 and is one of many freedom days celebrated in the country. The earliest Juneteenth celebrations included spirituals, feasts, and dances. And Juneteenth and Freedom Days commemorate the roles of African Americans in the struggle to abolish slavery, the struggle of Reconstruction, and the joy within the African American community. These celebrations are a testament to the resilience, cultural heritage, and ongoing fight for equality. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushlights.com/afam. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.